You're listening to the Valley Current.
Imagine waking up to find that $11.3 billion of taxpayer money just vanished.
Right. And not over a decade.
No, not over a decade, not over a year. In 6 days.
Yeah, 6 days. It's staggering.
It is. Imagine pouring your morning coffee, checking the news and seeing that the arteries of global energy trade have been suddenly, just violently choked off.
Completely shut down.
And then as you try to process the sheer scale of the disruption hitting your portfolio and really the whole global economy, you realize something even more unsettling.
That no one actually voted for.
Exactly. No one in Congress, the people you actively elect to make the most consequential decisions in the country, actually voted to authorize a single piece of it. Welcome to today. April 3, 2026.
It's a terrifying reality to wake up to. I mean, what makes it so disorienting is the sheer velocity of it all.
Right, the speed.
Yeah, the speed. We went from a tense but, familiar geopolitical standoff to a cascading global crisis in just a matter of weeks. And we bypassed almost every institutional safeguard along the way.
Which is the exact reason we are stripping away the usual noise today. We're focusing entirely on decoding one massive, deeply unsettling document for this deep dive.
The CLG report.
Yes, the Special Constitutional and Geopolitical Report. It's published by Jack Russo and his team at the Computer Law Group, or CLG. And look, they are not mincing words here.
No, they are really not.
They are asking a terrifying but very straightforward question. Did the United States inadvertently trigger World War III and in the process permanently break the United States Constitution?
It's a heavy question.
Very heavy. So our mission today is to unpack the kinetic facts on the ground, the financial fallout that is hitting you, the listener, right now, and this unprecedented constitutional void currently unfolding in Washington.
But before we dig into the machinery of all this, we really should establish a clear baseline.
Yes, please do.
This CLG report deals with incredibly raw, highly charged political actions, names.
Yeah.
It analyzes a current U.S. president whose term naturally ends in January 2029. And it scrutinizes the actions of former presidents, too. Obama, Clinton, Nixon, Trump.
I am so glad you brought that up because we need to make a binding promise to you, the listener, right now. We are absolutely not taking political sides today.
Yeah, definitely not.
If you are tuning in for partisan cheerleading, you are in the wrong place. Our mission is to look at the cold, hard mechanics of power. We are analyzing legal frameworks, historical precedents, and the factual realities of the battlefield and the market, exactly as they are laid out in this report.
Because the stakes are far too systemic for standard cable news talking points, To give you the immediate context, we are exactly 5 weeks into a military campaign the Pentagon has dubbed Operation Epic Fury.
Operation Epic Fury.
Right. And there is a massive ticking clock set for April 29 of this year, 2026, a deadline that could force a constitutional showdown unlike anything we have seen since the 1970s.
So let's start with the physical reality. We have to rewind the tape just a bit to February 28th, 2026. The report lays out the inception of this crisis, and, it was not a minor escalation.
No, not at all.
The United States and Israel launched massive coordinated airstrikes on Iran. We are talking about over 125 U.S. aircraft involved. This wasn't, a precision drone strike on a single convoy.
No, this was a systemic decapitation strike aimed at the very top tier of the Iranian power structure. The initial wave killed Supreme Leader Khamenei and approximately 40 senior officials.
Wow.
Yeah. In terms of scale and immediate strategic impact, this is the largest American military campaign launched since the shock and awe invasion of Iraq back in 2003.
And the blowback didn't take weeks to materialize. It happened instantly.
Overnight, really.
According to Russo's timeline, Iran retaliated by firing hundreds of ballistic missiles across 6 different countries. But the critical move, the one that really shook the globe, happened on March 2.
Closing the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. They effectively closed the strait. That is a maritime choke point that strangles 20 million barrels of oil a day.
A massive chunk of the global supply.
And they deliberately attacked Bahrain's desalination infrastructure. Brent crude oil blew past $113 a barrel almost overnight.
We also have to look at the direct human and financial toll here. We have 13 U.S. service members confirmed killed. And on the financial side, the Pentagon quietly briefed senators that those first 6 days of the operation alone burned through $11.3 billion.
$11.3 billion in 6 days.
Yeah. And as we sit here today, The daily operating cost to the United States taxpayer is hovering around $1.5 billion every single day.
I want to pause on that phrase Russo uses in the report. He explicitly calls this a World War III scenario. Now, I have to push back on this a bit.
Sure.
Is World War III just clickbait for lawyers? I mean, the Middle East has been a tinderbox for our entire lives. We've seen proxy wars, we've seen oil shocks in the 70s, massive escalations. Is this truly a global conflict, or are we just slapping a terrifying label on a severe regional conflict that the global markets will, eventually absorb and adapt to?
It is the most important question you can ask, really. And Russo addresses it by fundamentally redefining what a world war actually looks like in the 21st century.
Okay, how so?
Well, when we hear World War III, our minds go straight to the cinematic doomsday, right?
Yeah.
ICBMs launching massive tank battles in Europe, instant global annihilation.
Right, the classic Cold War nightmare.
Exactly. But the report argues that modern global conflict works differently now. A World War III scenario today is a conflict that begins in one specific theater, but rapidly pulls in multiple sovereign nations. And it does that because the web of global dependencies is suddenly snapping.
So it's about the connections breaking.
Yeah, it's about vital, interlocking interests being exposed all at once. The U.S. and Israel strike, Iran retaliates across borders, Gulf states are suddenly caught in a ballistic crossfire.
Right.
A massive percentage of the world's energy supply is stopped dead in the water. And crucial Western air defense capabilities are suddenly split between defending the Middle East and managing the ongoing war in Ukraine.
And when you look at the war aims of everyone involved, they are completely incompatible. Washington wants Iran's nuclear uranium stockpile eradicated and Hezbollah's funding networks permanently dismantled. Tehran wants a formal cessation of hostilities, vast financial compensation, and they demand that the situation in Lebanon be folded into any ceasefire.
And Israel has its own goals.
Right. Meanwhile, Israel wants to maintain absolute, unquestioned, preemptive strike capability across the region. Everyone wants everything. And everyone has a tactical reason to believe that dropping just one more bomb might improve their leverage at a negotiation table that doesn't even exist yet.
Which is exactly why the conflict refuses to contain itself.
Exactly.
And to answer your skepticism about the World War III label, the CLG analysis points to two incredibly dangerous wildcards.
Okay.
Wildcards that elevate this far beyond a standard regional skirmish.
Mm-hmm.
The first wildcard is water, specifically desalination infrastructure.
Water. You mentioned the strikes on Bahrain earlier. Walk me through why a water facility is a global trigger point.
Let's look at the geography and the engineering of the region. The Gulf Cooperation Council nations, places like Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they operate over 400 desalination plants.
Oh, 400.
Yeah. They account for roughly 60% of the entire global capacity for turning seawater into drinking water. Countries like Bahrain and Qatar rely on those plants for 100% of their fresh water.
Wait, 100%?
100%.
Yeah.
And the UAE relies on them for over 80%.
So they literally do not have natural drinking water to support their populations without these machines running constantly.
They do not. It's a completely engineered survival. And Iran has explicitly threatened Gulf power grids and these specific desalination facilities.
Oh, wow.
If a barrage of ballistic missiles takes those grids offline in a sustained way, you are no longer just dealing with a military problem. You are looking at a catastrophic, immediate humanitarian crisis.
Because you can't just ship in enough water for millions of people overnight.
Exactly. Millions of people will run out of drinking water in a matter of days. You can survive an oil shock, the economy takes a hit, but people live. You cannot survive a week without water. If those plants go down, every major power in the world is forced to intervene, whether they want to or not.
That completely reframes the entire battlefield. The water grid isn't just a piece of infrastructure, it is a societal kill switch.
It really is.
What is the second wild card?
Uranium. And honestly, this makes the water crisis look almost predictable by comparison.
Really?
Yeah. Before Operation Epic Fury kicked off, the report notes that Iran had amassed 441 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60%.
For context, what does 60% actually mean? I know weapons grade is usually around, 90%?
Right, 90%. So 60% is highly significant because the hardest, most time-consuming part of enriching uranium is getting it from its natural state up to 20%.
Okay.
Going from 20 to 60 is relatively fast, and going from 60 to 90% weapons grade is incredibly rapid. It's often called breakout time.
Ah, I've heard that term.
Yeah. With 441 kilograms sitting at 60%, if they choose to further enrich it, they possess enough raw material for approximately 9 nuclear weapons. 9. And here's the truly terrifying part. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has been physically locked out of the country since June 2025.
Wait, so the international inspectors have had no eyes on the ground for nearly a year?
None. 0. The international community cannot verify where that stockpile is. We don't know whether it has been moved to deeply buried subterranean facilities or whether the enrichment process to 90% has already occurred.
So we are flying completely blind.
Completely. You have incompatible war aims, a potential water apocalypse looming over the Gulf, and a completely unaccounted for nuclear stockpile. That is why Russo's report suggests the odds of a systemic multi-theater war are no longer remote enough for anyone to safely ignore.
So the stakes are existential on a global level. But while diplomats and generals are paralyzed, the financial markets are moving aggressively.
Oh, they're not waiting around.
No, the ripple effects are already tearing through the global economy and hitting the wallet of the person listening to us right now. Which brings us to a fascinating part of the report, the Investor's Survival Guide in a Geopolitical Vacuum.
The CLG analysis gets highly practical here, which is interesting for a legal and geopolitical report.
Yeah, it shifts gears.
They recognize that while the political system is frozen, capital cannot afford to freeze. Capital has to find a place to hide. The report outlines 4 specific asset class recommendations for navigating this kind of unprecedented systemic risk.
The first one on their list is the oldest safe haven in human history, gold. But I want to understand the why here. We always hear, buy gold when things get scary, but the report focuses specifically on central banks.
The focus on central banks is key to understanding the current market. Gold is the ultimate historical bearer asset.
Bearer asset.
Right. A bearer asset is simply something that has value in and of itself, and whoever holds it owns it. It is not dependent on a government's promise to pay you back, like a treasury bond is.
Okay, that makes sense.
What the report points out is that central banks around the world haven't just been passively holding gold, they've been aggressively hoarding it. We have seen accumulation rates of over 1,000 tons a year for the past 3 years.
So the people who literally print the fiat money are quietly exchanging it for physical gold.
Exactly. They know what's up. Because despite any short-term price volatility, gold has a pristine track record of surviving capital destruction across every major conflict in modern history. It is the top priority for capital preservation precisely because it lacks counterparty risk.
Meaning you don't rely on anyone else.
Right. Nobody else has to stay solvent for your gold to be valuable.
That concept of counterparty risk is crucial. The second recommendation is something the report calls defensive yield, specifically pointing to instruments like BOXX and FLOT. These sound like stock tickers, but we really need to translate the mechanics. What is FLOT, and why is it better than just holding a regular bond right now?
Let's break down the mechanics. FLOT is an exchange-traded fund, an ETF, that holds over 500 investment-grade floating-rate bonds.
Floating rate, okay.
Now imagine you buy a standard fixed-rate bond. You lock in a 4% return for 10 years. But suddenly, a massive war breaks out, supply chains collapse, inflation skyrockets to 10%, and the central bank jacks up interest rates to fight it.
So my 4% bond is suddenly terrible.
It's terrible. Your fixed 4% bond is now losing you money against inflation, and if you try to sell it, the price is plummeted because new bonds are paying much higher rates.
You are basically anchored to the bottom of the ocean while the tide comes in.
That is a perfect analogy. Floating rate bonds, on the other hand, are like a financial surfboard. The interest they pay actually adjusts upward as broader market interest rates rise.
Ah, so you float on top of the rate hikes.
Exactly. So if the war causes inflation and rate hikes, the yield on SLOT floats up with it. You get a shield against interest rate volatility.
Okay, and what about BOXX? The report says it uses a strategy involving treasury bills to, and I'm quoting here, convert yield into share price appreciation. How does that actually work for a listener trying to protect their cash?
BOXX uses a complex strategy involving options on the S&P 500. But the end result for the investor is quite simple. It mimics the return of a 1 to 3 month treasury bill.
Okay.
But here's the clever part. Normally, if you hold treasury bills, you get paid interest every month.
Right.
And you have to pay taxes on that interest immediately as ordinary income.
Right, which eats into your returns.
Exactly. BOXX is structured so it doesn't pay out monthly dividends. Instead, the actual price of the ETF share slowly goes up by the amount of the yield.
Oh, I see.
This means you only pay taxes when you eventually sell the shares, potentially at a much lower long-term capital gains rate.
So the overarching theme here is preserving optionality. You are keeping your powder dry, you are earning a safe return, you are protected from interest rate spikes, and you aren't taking on the massive risks currently associated with the broader stock market.
Precisely. You're hiding out but still making a return. The third recommendation shifts slightly to offense, or rather defensive offense. The report highlights XAR, which is the State Street SPDR S&P Aerospace and Defense ETF.
Playing the macro trend of global rearmament.
Yes, and the logic here is completely independent of how Operation Epic Fury ends. The report notes that NATO raised real defense spending by 20% in 2025 alone.
20% in 1 year is huge for government spending.
It's massive. Major European defense contractors like MBDA are expecting a 40% jump in production. The critical insight from Russo's team is that these trends will persist even if a ceasefire in the Middle East is signed tomorrow morning.
Because the illusion of global peace has been shattered.
The paradigm has fundamentally shifted. For 30 years, Western nations assumed they could fight small counterinsurgency wars and rely on just-in-time manufacturing for their militaries.
Right, keeping inventories lean.
That era is over. Every nation on Earth is currently looking at their stockpiles of artillery shells, interceptor missiles, and drones and realizing they are terrifyingly empty. Restocking those arsenals is a decade-long, multi-trillion-dollar structural trend.
So defense equities aren't just a short-term tactical trade based on the news cycle. They are a long-term infrastructural reality.
Yeah.
Now, the final asset they recommend is definitely going to raise some eyebrows for traditional investors. Bitcoin.
It is controversial, for sure, but the report makes a compelling, strictly mechanical argument for it. Bitcoin is described as a scarce, neutral, digital bearer asset.
There is that term again? Bearer asset, like gold.
Yes.
Yes.
But a digital one.
Yeah.
In this specific geopolitical context, its primary feature is that its ledger is distributed across thousands of nodes worldwide. It is not sitting on a central server in New York or London.
Right.
This means it is not subject to unilateral state seizure or freezing.
Because if you think about traditional banking, if a government decides you are an enemy of the state, or if the SWIFT banking system is weaponized as a tool of war, they can just turn off your bank account with a keystroke.
Just like that. Or think about if a local currency collapses because of hyperinflation during a war. If the base case scenario for the global economy shifts towards systemic capital destruction and sovereign defaults, an asset that has zero organizational counterparty risk gains a very meaningful bid.
You don't need permission to use it.
Exactly. You don't need a central bank to stay solvent, you don't need a clearinghouse to process the trade, and you don't need international shipping lanes open to move it.
I look at this list: gold, floating rate bonds, defense stocks, and Bitcoin, and it paints a very clear picture. Your traditional 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, is like a house built perfectly for sunny weather.
Good in peacetime.
Right. It relies entirely on the assumption that international trade works, that supply chains hum along quietly, and that multinational cooperation is the default state of the world. But what CLG is outlining here are your financial hurricane shutters and your emergency generators.
That's the perfect way to look at it.
It really asks you, the listener, a vital question. Are you holding any assets that actually belong to you, or is your entire net worth reliant on the international system miraculously holding together while the Strait of Hormuz burns?
Is a profound portfolio check. If the markets are bracing for a structural shock, they are telling us something fundamental about the political reality.
And that political reality is the core of this entire deep dive. We know the military is flying the sorties. We know the markets are battening down the hatches. But who actually authorized the president to launch 125 aircraft at a sovereign nation?
And that is the billion-dollar question.
We have to leave the financial markets and enter the halls of Congress, because we are looking at a constitutional void and an April 29 deadline that is rushing toward us.
Yeah, this is where Russo's report drops the absolute legal bombshell.
Yeah.
There is no authorization for use of military force, commonly called an AUMF, that covers military action against Iran.
I want to be incredibly clear on this. None. There is no piece of paper passed by Congress authorizing this specific war.
There is absolutely none.
Wow.
For decades, presidents have historically stretched the 2002 Iraq AUMFs, the one passed after 9/11 for Saddam Hussein, to justify various counterterrorism operations across the entire region. But Congress officially repealed that specific 2002 AUMF back in December of 2025.
Just a few months before Operation Epic Fury kicked off.
Exactly. So the president is currently operating the largest military campaign in a generation entirely without statutory authorization from the legislative branch.
And it's not like Congress doesn't know about it.
No, and it's not because Congress is unaware or hasn't discussed it. The Senate has actually brought war powers resolutions to the floor 3 separate times since the strikes began.
And what happened?
They rejected them with votes of 47 to 53. The House brought up a resolution to halt the action. They rejected it 212 to 219.
So they are debating it, they are voting on it, but they are affirmatively choosing to do absolutely nothing. They won't vote to officially authorize it, and they won't vote to stop it.
They are completely paralyzed. Which brings us to the critical ticking clock. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 mandates a 60-day window for unauthorized military action. That clock officially expires on April 29, 2026.
To understand why this 60-day clock matters and why the current situation is so broken, we really have to do a deep dive into the Constitution itself. The report anchors its entire argument on Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. Take us back to the framers in Philadelphia.
We have to understand the psychology of the men in that room in 1787. They had just fought a brutal war against the British Empire, and their primary fear was recreating a monarch.
A king with an army.
Exactly. A single individual with the power to plunge the entire nation into the blood and debt of a war on a whim. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 clearly states that Congress shall have power to declare war.
But the phrasing of that wasn't accidental. There was a massive debate over specific words, right?
A profound debate. The original draft of the Constitution gave Congress the power to make war. But during the convention, James Madison and Elbridge Gerry moved to strike the word make and substitute the word declare.
Why does changing make to declare fundamentally alter the balance of power? It seems like a minor semantic shift.
Because it recognizes the reality of self-defense while heavily restricting offensive action. By changing it to declare, the framers explicitly intended to leave the executive branch, the president, with only the power to repel sudden attacks.
Ah, I see.
So if a foreign armada suddenly appears off the coast of New York, the president does not have to wait 3 weeks for Congress to ride their horses into Washington to convene a vote. The president, as commander-in-chief, can immediately order the military to fire back and repel the attack.
They can manage the defense in an emergency?
Exactly. But the president absolutely cannot independently launch a preemptive offensive military campaign against a foreign nation.
Which is exactly what Operation Epic Fury is. A preemptive, coordinated strike involving 125 aircraft.
It's the textbook definition of offensive war-making. Madison actually wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson a few years later in 1798, explaining their reasoning. He wrote that the executive branch is the branch most naturally interested in war, most prone to it, and most likely to gain power from it.
It's human nature, really.
Yes. Therefore, the Constitution, with what he called studied care, vested the terrifying power of initiating war solely in the legislature. The representatives of the people have to take the vote because the people are the ones who will pay for it and die in it.
That is the theory. But if we look at the historical record the report provides, we have drifted light years away from Madison and Gerry's vision. The U.S. has only formally declared war 5 times in its entire history.
Yeah, the last time Congress officially passed a declaration of war was against Romania in 1942 during World War II. Think about the sheer volume of conflict since then.
It's endless.
The Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now Iran. Every single one of those massive generational conflicts was waged under complex theories of executive authority or stretched statutory authorizations that the framers of the Constitution would look at with absolute horror.
I look at this 1973 War Powers Resolution and its 60-day clock, and honestly, it feels exactly like a digital trial subscription.
A trial subscription.
Yeah, think about it. The president essentially swiped the American taxpayer's credit card for a 60-day free trial of a massive war. And now the trial period is coming to an end on April 29.
Oh, I like this.
But instead of canceling the service or asking for permission to keep it, the president is just letting the military campaign run. And Congress, acting like the bank, refuses to formally approve the ongoing subscription, but they also refuse to decline the charge.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the dysfunction. The War Powers Resolution was born out of the trauma of the Vietnam War. Congress passed it over President Richard Nixon's veto in 1973, specifically to claw back their power.
Right?
The law states that if the president introduces forces into hostilities without a declaration of war, he must report to Congress within 48 hours. That starts the 60-day clock. If Congress does not explicitly authorize the action within those 60 days, the president is legally required to withdraw the armed forces.
But presidents just ignore it.
Almost universally. Every president since Nixon, Democrat and Republican alike, has claimed that the War Powers Resolution is an unconstitutional infringement on their authority as commander-in-chief. And historically, none of them have ever been legally forced by a court to comply with that 60-day withdrawal mandate.
If the president ignores the 60-day clock and Congress flat out refuses to pass a formal authorization, what actual tangible tools does the American system have left to hit the brakes on a multi-billion-dollar war? If we look closely at the report, there is one mechanism that is absolute. It is the power of the purse.
This is where we shift from theoretical debates over war powers to the cold, hard reality of money. If the War Powers Resolution lacks teeth, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the Constitution is a titanium trap.
A titanium trap?
Yes. It reads, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law."
Meaning you cannot fly a fighter jet without jet fuel, and you cannot buy jet fuel without Congress writing the check.
Exactly. It is the ultimate, undeniable power of the legislative branch. And as Russo's report heavily emphasizes, defunding a war is not just a theoretical academic concept. Congress has successfully used this exact power to stop presidents in the past.
Let's examine those precedents. The report brings up the Cooper-Church Amendment and the Case-Church Amendment. Put us in the room for those.
We have to go back to the early 1970s. The nation is deeply divided over the Vietnam War. President Nixon had secretly expanded the war by bombing and then launching a ground incursion into Cambodia.
Right, without telling Congress.
Congress was furious that he had expanded the theater of war without their approval. So between 1969 and 1973, Congress enacted 7 different statutory funding limitations.
They started turning the spigot off.
Step by step. The Cooper-Church Amendment passed in early 1971. It legally prohibited the use of any appropriated funds for introducing U.S. ground combat troops into Cambodia. It was an earth-shattering moment. The first time Congress had successfully restricted the deployment of troops during an active conflict against the explicit wishes of the commander-in-chief.
And Case-Church was the final blow.
Case-Church was the legislative hammer. In July 1973, Congress passed an amendment that barred all funds for any combat activities in or over Cambodia, Laos, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam after August 15, 1973.
They put a hard date on the calendar.
And on August 15, the U.S. bombing officially ended. The mechanism worked flawlessly. Even Richard Nixon, a president who pushed the boundaries of executive power to their absolute limits, never once challenged Congress's constitutional right to cut off the funds. The power of the purse is absolute. It simply requires the political courage to wield it.
Which brings us crashing back to the reality of April 2026. There's a massive piece of legislation currently sitting in Washington, a $200 billion supplemental funding request specifically requested by the Pentagon to sustain Operation Epic Fury in Iran.
Think about the leverage that provides. Every single dollar of that $200 billion requires an affirmative on-the-record vote from the House and the Senate. Combined with the War Powers deadline expiring on April 29, Congress currently possesses a massive, perfectly legal window of constitutional authority to stop this conflict tomorrow by simply refusing to pass the supplemental funding.
I look at this dynamic, and the hypocrisy is almost breathtaking. For the listener trying to make sense of the news, you see members of Congress on television every night. They are giving impassioned speeches. They are tweeting. They are complaining that the president is a rogue actor, that the war is dangerous, that it's unconstitutional.
Oh, the rhetoric is very loud.
Very loud. But in the same breath, they are preparing to vote yes on a $200 billion check to buy the bombs. If they sign that check, aren't they fully co-signing the war?
They absolutely are, legally and morally. And that is the paradox of political paralysis that Russo identifies. Congress desperately wants the political benefit of opposing a controversial war for their anti-war constituents without taking the political risk of actually defunding troops who are actively deployed in a hostile theater.
The support the troops trap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is viewed as politically toxic, basically electoral suicide, to be the politician who cuts off the supply lines for American soldiers under fire. So the Senate and House perform this elaborate theater.
Yeah.
They vote down resolutions to end the war, effectively guaranteeing the conflict continues, while loudly protesting the president's overreach and simultaneously preparing to rubber stamp the $200 billion.
So they complain, they sign the check, the missiles keep flying, and the April 29 constitutional deadline gets blown past like a stop sign in the desert.
Exactly.
So if Congress lacks the basic political courage to cut the funding and the president refuses to stop, the CLG report points to the absolute final resort, the nuclear option of constitutional law. We are talking about the impeachment paradox.
When we evoke Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, we are dealing with the gravest tool in the democratic arsenal, impeachment for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
Some big guns.
Right. And what is fascinating about Russo's analysis is how strongly he argues that unilaterally waging an unauthorized war is the exact scenario the framers built the impeachment clause for.
We have to look at Alexander Hamilton here, Federalist number 69. How did Hamilton view the president's military power?
Hamilton was trying to sell the new Constitution to a very skeptical public, and he needed to prove that the president was not just a king with a different title.
A tough sell right after the Revolution.
Very. He drew a brilliant structural distinction. He said the British king possessed the absolute power to declare war, raise armies, and direct them. The American president, Hamilton argued, has a vastly inferior power. The president's role as commander-in-chief amounts to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military forces. He is the top general.
So the general executes the war, but the general does not get to decide if a war happens. That belongs to Congress.
Precisely. Congress decides if the nation goes to war. And Hamilton explicitly noted that this separation of powers is backed by a lethal threat. Unlike a king, a president who usurps the legislature's exclusive power to declare war is personally liable to be impeached, tried, and removed from office. Stealing the war power is the textbook definition of a high crime against the Republic.
The report backs this up with a modern source, too, the 1974 House Judiciary Committee staff report on impeachment.
That 1974 report, drafted during the Nixon-Watergate era, remains the gold standard for defining what actually constitutes an impeachable offense. It defined impeachable conduct using three specific forces: arrogation of power, abuse of the governmental process, and disregard of constitutional duties.
Those are strong words.
They are.
Yeah.
If a president launches a massive military campaign like Epic Fury without consulting Congress, ignoring the War Powers Resolution, that hits every single one of those definitions simultaneously. The legal scholarship is virtually unanimous on this point. Unauthorized war-making is an impeachable offense.
The legal theory is airtight, but the historical reality is a graveyard of failed attempts. The report walks us through past efforts to impeach presidents over war powers, and it is a brutal track record. Walk me through the Nixon attempt in 1973.
During the Watergate impeachment proceedings, Representative Elizabeth Holtzman drafted Article 4. This article specifically charged Richard Nixon with submitting false statements to Congress to conceal the secret, unauthorized bombing campaign in Cambodia. It argued this was a direct derogation of Congress's power to declare war.
It sounds like an incredibly strong charge. What happened?
The Judiciary Committee defeated it by a vote of 26-12. They refused to include it in the final articles of impeachment.
Wait, why would they defeat it if he clearly hid the bombing?
Because of the deep, uncomfortable reality of congressional complicity. Congress had been authorizing and funding the broader Vietnam War machinery for years. Many members of the committee felt that Congress lacked the moral and political authority to impeach Nixon for prosecuting a war in Southeast Asia that they had been quietly funding the entire time.
Let's jump forward to a completely different era. Bill Clinton in 1999, the Kosovo campaign.
This is perhaps the most bizarre example of congressional contradiction in modern history.
How so?
The Clinton administration launched an air war over Kosovo. Congress held a series of votes. They explicitly voted against declaring war. They tied on a vote to authorize the air campaign, meaning the authorization failed. They voted against a resolution requiring withdrawal.
So they basically voted no on every possible option.
They did. And then a few weeks later, they turned around and passed an emergency spending bill appropriating $13 billion to fully fund the military operations they had just refused to authorize.
That is just wild.
Yeah. Despite this blatant violation of the War Powers Resolution, no articles of impeachment were ever seriously pursued.
How about the Obama administration in 2011 with the intervention in Libya?
The Obama administration used a very novel legal theory. They argued that because U.S. forces were primarily conducting airstrikes and flying drones from offshore, and there were no U.S. boots on the ground taking casualties, the operation didn't even reach the threshold of hostilities under the War Powers Resolution. Therefore, the 60-day clock didn't apply.
Basically arguing that if we are shooting at them but they can't shoot back, it's not a war.
Exactly. And it's worth noting his own Office of Legal Counsel reportedly disagreed with that assessment. The House of Representatives was furious. They formally rebuked the president in a bipartisan vote, 268 to 145.
But did they impeach?
Some members, like Representative Dennis Kucinich, publicly suggested impeachment, but again, it went nowhere. No articles were filed. The funding continued.
And finally, a very recent example from the report, Donald Trump in June of 2025.
This was just last year, following an earlier, smaller round of strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Representative Al Green filed a privilege resolution charging Trump with unconstitutionally usurping Congress's power to declare war.
Did it even make it to a debate?
It was tabled immediately. The House voted 344 to 79 to kill the resolution. 128 Democrats actually joined the Republicans to table it.
Why?
The primary reason wasn't necessarily legal, it was political. Democratic leadership did not want to pursue a deeply divisive impeachment process heading into the upcoming 2026 midterm elections.
There is a glaring, fatal flaw tying every single one of these historical failures together.
It is the mechanism of congressional complicity. Representative John Seiberling articulated it perfectly back in 1974 during the Nixon hearings.
How was his argument?
He argued that you cannot legitimately impeach a president for taking actions that previous presidents have taken with impunity, and more importantly, for actions that Congress itself bears a deep measure of responsibility for through its appropriations. If Congress signs the checks, they surrender their moral standing to impeach the president for cashing them.
I am reminded of a brilliant quote from Elizabeth Holtzman that Russo includes in the report. After her article on the Cambodia bombing failed, she asked, "How can we impeach the president for concealing a burglary, but not for concealing a massive bombing?"
It really highlights the absurdity.
It does. I look at this dynamic, and it reminds me of an incredibly dysfunctional human resources department at a massive corporation.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine an HR department that constantly sends out memos threatening to fire a rogue executive for breaking company rules, let's say, taking unauthorized, lavish, million-dollar business trips. The HR department screams that it's against the rules, it's a fireable offense, but every single month when that rogue executive submits their expense reports for those exact trips, the HR department dutifully stamps approved and wires the money.
Right.
At a certain point, the HR department cannot fire the executive because by funding the rule breaking, they have become an active participant in it.
That is the exact mechanism of failure here. The power of the purse and the power of impeachment should be complementary checks on the executive branch. But in reality, they cancel each other out when political survival gets in the way.
But Russo's report highlights a unique twist in our current April 2026 scenario that makes this totally different from the past. We are dealing with a president whose term naturally ends in January 2029. How does the constitutional math of impeachment actually work against a lame duck clock?
This is where it gets very technical.
We need to look at the late-term calculus, the two-thirds problem, and a fascinating loophole called disqualification.
The constitutional math here gets incredibly granular. Let's look at the sheer numbers required to remove a president. In the House of Representatives, you only need a simple majority to impeach, that is, 218 votes out of 435. That is relatively easy if the opposing party controls the chamber.
But impeachment is just the indictment. The actual trial happens in the Senate.
And that is where the math becomes nearly impossible. Article 1, Section 3 requires a two-thirds supermajority of the Senate to convict and remove a president. That is 67 senators.
What does that map look like right now in the 119th Congress?
Currently, the president's party, the Republicans, hold 53 Senate seats. So even if every single Democrat and independent voted to convict, you would still need 20 Republican senators to cross the aisle and vote to remove their own party's president during an active global wartime campaign.
Historically speaking, getting 20 senators to basically nuke their own party leader during a war is pure political fantasy.
It just won't happen.
So if you cannot realistically get 67 votes to remove the president, and the president's term is naturally going to expire on January 20th, 2029 anyway because of the 22nd Amendment's term limits, Why bother going through the trauma of an impeachment? Is it just giant, expensive political theater to appease an angry voter base?
That is exactly where Russo's report uncovers a rarely discussed, incredibly potent constitutional loophole.
A loophole?
Yes. The penalty for being convicted in an impeachment trial is not strictly limited to removal from office. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7 allows the Senate to impose an additional permanent penalty, disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Disqualification, meaning a permanent ban from the federal government.
Forever. And here's the crucial mechanical distinction. While removing a sitting president requires that impossible 67-vote supermajority, Senate precedent dating back to 1862 establishes that a vote for disqualification is a separate discretionary vote.
And how many votes does that take?
And that vote requires only a simple majority, 51 votes.
Wait, I want to make sure I completely understand this. It only takes 51 votes to ban someone from federal office for the rest of their life?
Yes. If they're convicted first, yes. And this operates completely independently of the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment just says you can't be elected president more than twice, but a disqualification vote is a permanent exile. It means the individual can never be appointed to a cabinet post, they can never serve as a federal judge, they can never be an ambassador, they can never hold any federal office whatsoever.
But can you even run an impeachment trial for someone who has already left office or is literally packing their boxes to leave?
The historical precedent strongly says yes. The report points to the famous Belknap case from 1876.
Belknap? What happened there?
William Belknap was the Secretary of War. He was caught in a massive corruption scandal. Literally hours before the House was scheduled to vote on his impeachment, Belknap rushed to the White House, handed his resignation to President Ulysses S. Grant in tears, and became a private citizen. He thought he had outsmarted the system and evaded the trial.
Did it work?
It did not. The House impeached him anyway. When it got to the Senate, Belknap's lawyers argued the Senate had no jurisdiction over a private citizen. The Senate held a specific vote on that exact question and determined 37-29, that they absolutely retain jurisdiction to try former officials for crimes committed while in office.
We don't have to look back to 1876 to see this. We saw this incredibly recently.
We saw it in 2021 with Donald Trump's second impeachment. The House impeached him on January 13th, exactly 1 week before his term ended. The entire Senate trial occurred in February, after he had already left the White House and resumed life as a private citizen in Florida. His defense team made the exact same argument Belknap made: you can't try a former president.
And what did the Senate say?
The Senate held a threshold vote and affirmed, 56-44, that trying a former president was entirely constitutional. Furthermore, over 150 constitutional scholars from across the ideological spectrum signed a letter agreeing that the disqualification clause would be rendered completely meaningless if a president could commit high crimes in their final weeks in office and escape any permanent penalty simply by letting the clock run out.
The financial markets are actually taking this specific timeline very seriously. The report notes that polymarket prediction odds are placing a roughly 70% probability on articles of impeachment being filed.
But there is a catch.
Right. It is heavily contingent on the upcoming November 2026 midterms.
Yes, the timeline is tightly bound to the election cycle. If the opposition party wins control of the House of Representatives in November 2026, the path becomes clear. The new Congress is seated on January 3, 2027. They could instantly launch an impeachment inquiry regarding the unauthorized execution of Operation Epic Fury.
Because they have the majority.
Exactly. With a simple majority, they could draft and pass the articles. The trial moves to the Senate in 2027 or 2028. And even if the legal wrangling drags on until after the president leaves office in January 2029, the Senate can still hold that trial, seek a conviction, and execute that simple majority vote to permanently disqualify.
Let me play devil's advocate here. If the person is already term limited out of the presidency and they are, say, in their 80s, what is the actual point of spending 2 years of legislative time just to ban them from being an ambassador to a country they don't even want to go to? Is it really just about tarnishing a legacy?
It is about something much larger than one person's legacy. It is about establishing and defending constitutional boundaries. Russo makes a profound point here. Disqualification is not just a petty symbolic sanction. Right now, it is the only mechanism left in the American system to ensure that launching an unauthorized multi-billion-dollar war has some permanent, legally binding consequence.
It sets a precedent.
Exactly. If a president can unilaterally launch 125 aircraft, risk millions of lives, shatter the global energy market, and suffer absolutely zero constitutional penalty simply because their term naturally expired, then the entire concept of checks and balances has failed.
It's a free pass.
Yeah. A disqualification vote, even if it happens post-presidency, physically writes into the legal and historical record that the action was a violation of the public trust. It serves as a stark warning to the next president who thinks about bypassing Congress.
So we have a Congress that is paralyzed by political cowardice and refuses to use the power of the purse. We have an impeachment process that is mathematically impossible regarding removal and requires threading a massive needle just to achieve a post-presidency disqualification.
It's a bleak picture.
It really is. If the legislative branch is this thoroughly broken and unwilling to defend its own power, surely the judicial branch will step in, right? I mean, we have a Supreme Court. Their entire job is to interpret the Constitution and tell the other branches when they are breaking the rules.
You would naturally assume the courts would be the ultimate referee here. But the stark, depressing reality outlined in the report is this: the courts will not save us. They will actively refuse to help.
How can they refuse to rule on whether a massive war is constitutional?
They rely on a legal framework known as the political question doctrine. To understand how they use it, the CLG report points us to a landmark case from the year 2000, Campbell v. Clinton, decided by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Walk us through the mechanics of that lawsuit. Who was suing whom?
A group of sitting members of Congress, led by Representative Tom Campbell, literally sued President Bill Clinton in federal court. They argued that Clinton was blatantly violating the War Powers Resolution by continuing the heavy bombing campaign over Yugoslavia without having received explicit congressional authorization after the 60-day clock expired.
It sounds like a perfect test case. A clear violation, members of Congress as the plaintiffs. What did the judge do?
The court threw the case out entirely.
On what grounds?
The courts utilized two incredibly powerful legal shields: standing and ripeness. Standing essentially asks, are you the right person to bring this lawsuit, and have you been personally directly harmed by the action?
Okay.
The courts ruled that individual members of Congress do not have standing to sue the president over war powers because the injury isn't to them personally. It's an institutional dispute between the executive and legislative branches.
And what does ripeness mean?
Ripeness asks, is this conflict actually ready for a judge to decide, or are there still political tools available to solve it? In Campbell v. Clinton, the court looked at Congress's behavior and pointed out the blatant hypocrisy. They noted that Congress was sending conflicting signals.
How so?
Congress had voted against authorizing the war, but they had also just passed a massive appropriations bill to fund the exact same war.
The HR department analogy again.
Precisely. The judicial branch's message to Congress was brutally clear. You have the power of the purse. You have the power of impeachment. You have massive constitutional weapons at your disposal to stop this president. Do not run to the courts and ask us to solve a political problem that you are simply too terrified of the voters to solve yourselves.
Wow.
That is the essence of the political question doctrine. The courts view war powers not as a legal puzzle to be solved, but as a political street fight that Congress and the president have to finish on their own.
The report quotes a constitutional scholar, Louis Fisher, who coined a phrase for this exact dynamic. He calls it the double failure of accountability.
It is the perfect encapsulation of the crisis. The courts point their fingers at Congress and say, use your institutional tools. Congress points their fingers at the political costs of cutting off funding during wartime and says, we can't. It's electoral suicide.
And the president just keeps going.
Exactly. And in the massive void created by this double failure, the power of the presidency expands infinitely.
It is like a multi-billion-dollar game of hot potato with the Constitution. The president seizes the war power. Congress complains but tosses the responsibility to the courts. The courts refuse to catch it and toss it right back to Congress. And meanwhile, the American taxpayer is left standing in the middle, holding a $1.5 billion day bill for a war no one in the room actually voted to approve.
That is the exact reality. And the tragic long-term result is what the legendary historian Henry Steele Commager called a strategic victory for the imperial presidency.
The imperial presidency.
Yeah, every single time an unauthorized war occurs and goes unpunished, the precedent compounds. The executive branch builds muscle memory. The next president looks back at Epic Fury or Libya or Kosovo and says, well, my predecessor didn't need to ask Congress for a declaration of war to drop bombs, so why should I be constrained? Oh. The remedy the framers carefully built in Philadelphia is rendered entirely politically unusable.
So if the courts refuse to act because of the political question doctrine, and Congress refuses to act because they're terrified of the political fallout, who is actually left to enforce the Constitution?
The report concludes that the ultimate check on presidential war-making is no longer institutional. It is strictly democratic. It relies entirely on the First Amendment.
The
public's capacity to apply overwhelming pressure. Historically, public protests, massive shifts in polling, and the brutal reality of the ballot box are what actually end unauthorized wars. When the formal institutions fail to check the president, the burden of the Constitution falls entirely onto the shoulders of the citizenry to demand accountability from the people writing the checks.
Which brings us to the profound reality of where we stand today. Let's just recap the staggering picture we are sitting in on April 3, 2026.
It's a lot to take in.
We have watched $11.3 billion evaporate in less than a week. The Strait of Hormuz is closed, choking off 20 million barrels of global oil supply a day. Desalination plants, the literal lifeblood of millions of people in the Gulf, are under direct threat.
The markets are flashing red.
Yeah, the financial markets are flashing red, forcing anyone paying attention to build a bunker of bearer assets, gold, floating rate bonds, defense equities, Bitcoin. And underneath it all, the United States Constitution is buckling under the immense weight of an imperial presidency and a completely paralyzed legislative branch. We are staring down a war powers deadline on April 29 that, in all likelihood, will come and go with nothing more than a few angry press releases.
It is the ultimate stress test of the American Republic. And Russo's CLG report leaves us with a chilling final thought to mull over. One that looks far beyond the daily market swings, the price of Brent crude, or the upcoming November midterms.
What's the thought?
The report notes that 50 years from now, historians are going to look back at this exact 5-week period as a major, irrevocable turning point in modern history.
Because if the framers' carefully designed system of checks and balances, the 60-day war powers clock, the absolute power of the purse, the severe threat of the impeachment mechanism, if all of those powerful tools can be entirely bypassed simply by keeping a military conflict in a perpetual state of conflicting signals, then a massive, deeply uncomfortable question remains for you to explore on your own.
Does the monumental power to declare war still belong to the people through their elected representatives? Or did we quietly, voluntarily hand the keys to the military-industrial complex over to an elected king simply because we were too distracted by the political theater to notice?
Think about your portfolio. Think about the institutions that govern you. Think about your ballot. And ask yourself what happens when the next unauthorized 60-day clock starts ticking.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.